Now, our next panel discussion is entitled Solving for Payment System Continuity, Engaging in Global Challenges. And this is moderated by Liseho Chauke Mutswane, the Chief Payments Officer at PASA. Please also welcome onto the stage her panelists for this conversation, Michael Hurd, who's the Senior Vice President for the ACH Network Administration at NACHA, Christina Logue, the Chief Financial Officer at Payments Canada, Andy White, the Chief Executive Officer at the Australian Payments Network, and Steve Wiggins, the Chief Executive Officer at Payments New Zealand.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us this afternoon as we delve into this topic of solving for payment system continuity and global challenges. And during the next 45 minutes, we will take a look at how different jurisdictions think and plan for continuity of their payment system in the case of disasters. And to help us, as mentioned by our host, we have four representatives from four different jurisdictions in both the northern and the southern hemisphere. I would like to start us off on this topic with a reference to a working paper that has been published by the International Monetary Fund in December of 2021, titled Operational Resilience in Digital Payments, Experiences and Issues. And the abstract states, major operational incidents in payment systems suggest the need to improve their resilience. Meanwhile, as infrastructure becomes more digitalized, integrated, and independent, they require an even higher degree of resilience. Moreover, risks that could trigger major disruptions have become more acute given the rise in power outages, cyber incidents, and natural disasters. International experience suggests the need to strengthen reliability objectives, redundancy, access, and assessment of critical service providers, endpoint security, and alternative arrangements. And that, I guess, will be the crux of our conversation today. And I'd like to open with a question to all our panel members. In your jurisdiction, what are the type of conversations taking place around payment system outages and natural disasters? And what type of themes or insights are emerging from those conversations? And I'll start with you, Steve.
Yeah, sure. Our conversations are very current at the moment within NZ off the back of a weather event earlier in the year called Cyclone Gabriel, thanks to climate change, which had a significant impact on the top part of the North Island of NZ and took out all the telecommunications, all of the electricity within a couple of key areas. So the conversations have been responding to that around, right, what were the areas that we did well, what were the areas that we didn't do well. And so the coordination there happens with our National Emergency Management Association. And so they did pretty well in a number of areas, but what they didn't do is get the right sort of, what are the key pieces of infrastructure that we need to be sorting out. So we had incidents when, for example, when the cash trucks were trying to get into the region, they turned them around because they didn't see them as critical infrastructure. And the other thing that was totally ignored was around the digital payments. So really the focus has been quite strongly on electricity and telco and maybe not some of the other infrastructure. So the conversation is ongoing and it will continue for some time yet.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Stephen. I think when we get to lived experiences and some of the lessons, we will come back to some of that, that you've mentioned around the ecosystems that are part of this conversation. In some instances, are either included and excluded, with the consequences noted. But thank you for that intro. And then I'd like to now hand over the same question to Andy from Australian context, the conversations, themes, insights.
Sure. So again, very topical, like New Zealand. At a higher level, I guess, when you sort of think about the overall economy and digital economy, really following some cyber attacks and data breaches, we've seen large-scale data breaches at one of our telcos, also one of our smaller banks. The conversation has really been around what critical infrastructure looks like. So we've now got a critical infrastructure bill, which includes payment systems. And certainly our central bank as the payment policy regulator is looking at what that means for those payment systems in terms of their resilience and what kind of requirements might be around that. Also off the back of that critical infrastructure bill, we've seen our banking regulator really up the ante in terms of requirements on banks around their BCP and disaster recovery, and that includes payments as well. And then really sort of zeroing in on payments, there's a couple of things that we're actively leading work on in terms of migration of one of the networks that supports ATM traffic, our domestic debit scheme, our direct entry system, and digital check clearing, migrating that to a network where it has multiple telco providers so that you've got inbuilt resilience. And then the other migration is the migration that we're kicking off around our card system, and that's really around the security of the card payments, which will be threatened by certainly quantum computing when it arrives, whenever that is, but also mainstream computing over time. And so if we want that to be secure, we need to migrate that to what's called the Advanced Encryption Standard, and we've kicked off that program of work as well.
So quite a lot around redundancy and being able to offer alternatives in the event that some of your key systems are unable to deliver to the mandate. Thank you for that, Andy. Christina, Canada, how are these conversations going, and what are some of the lessons that you are learning from the discussions taking place?
Great, thank you. Very similar to what we've heard already, a lot of the challenges and what we're working towards are similar. So we're looking at different weather-related events, network resiliency, so telecom issues that we've experienced as a nation, we're looking to address. We also focus in on vendor issues with a small pool of vendors that we have that we leverage, and how we can build resiliency around that. Our conversation is quite detailed and in-depth with our central bank. It's sitting right beside us amidst those conversations and working out a very detailed plan on our roadmap for resiliency. So we have laid out sort of 3 levels of resiliency for our payment systems. We are just launching level 2 next week, which will include a third site similar to what New Zealand has done. We followed suit, and we, in order to mitigate the risk around our 2 data centers, so we do have a primary and secondary data center, which are located quite close in proximity to each other within Canada. What we've done is implemented a third site on a different continent to help mitigate some of that risk. So that was a very big step for us. It will technically go live next weekend. Hopefully we won't have to use it. It is for extreme contingency. And then we'll continue to work through our third level of resiliency, which will be more around leveraging different payment systems that we operate to offer resiliency and backup to each other.
Thank you for that, Christine. And I guess the theme around resiliency in various forms, and I think, the geographical consideration of localizing versus offshore, certainly something that is worth noting. And thank you for that insight. Mike, the U.S.,
yes,
very different dynamics.
Yeah, in the U.S., I think if you wait long enough, we'll have one of every kind of natural disaster. So financial institutions are expected to be able to have continuity of operations and provide services to customers even during natural disasters. I think current conversations, similar to what my colleagues have already talked about, really focus on man-made disasters as well, especially right now, cybersecurity. And top of mind is ransomware and wiperware types of attacks, where it's not just about committing fraud and getting money out of the system, but actually holding hostage an entity with their data locked in order to get a ransom payment to restore operations. So there's a huge press by regulators in the U.S. for institutions to have plans and capabilities to resist and recover from ransomware type of incidents.
very, as I said, quite a different dynamic to some of what we've heard. But as you mentioned, natural disasters seem to be also quite a common theme across the two hemispheres. I'd like to then also touch on, you've mentioned the various stakeholders involved, and they range from, your respective organizations, government, central banks. But I'd like to just get maybe a better sense of the broader industry engagements that are taking place. And taking my cue from Prof. Singh yesterday, who mentioned that, we're busy talking to each other about ourselves. And then to ask that question, to say, in all these engagements and discussions that are taking place on a very important topic, what is the voice of the end user? Are the consumers and business, small, medium enterprises involved, and they're part of the considerations, or are you, to Prof's sentiment, having the conversations amongst ourselves, with ourselves? And I'd like to pose this question to Andy, if I may.
Sure. So, I mean, there's an obvious focus on the institution, particularly when it's a cyber attack or a data breach. How did the institution allow that to happen? And I think we probably all experience that when we're dealing with our boards. There's a lot of focus internally in making sure that we're doing all the right things to prevent those kind of attacks. That said, my view actually would be that it's all about the end user. Because ultimately, why do those data breaches matter? Well, because they affect thousands of individuals who lose their personal data, may have to recreate their identities, subject to identity theft and all of those sorts of things. And certainly, in the Australian environment, there's a big focus on the consumer, particularly when we think about outages. I think Herman used the phrase outage outrage yesterday. That's certainly front of mind for our regulators. So as an example of that, the Reserve Bank now publishes statistics every quarter on the outages in each bank is experiencing in their payment systems. And I deliberately sort of phrase it that way because it is about the connectivity of those institutions to the payment system rather than the payment system itself. And what we've sort of seen since the publication of those statistics started last year is actually it's quite useful for those financial institutions. So initially, our members probably pushed back on the publication of that kind of data because they saw it as naming and shaming. But actually, if they're bottom of the league table and they've got a bit of an issue in terms of their connectivity, then it gives them the right to invest in fixing that. So it turns it into a compliance project, which actually can be quite useful in terms of prioritization of the investment to fix that. So we've certainly seen that from the financial institutions, and actually, the Reserve Bank has kind of led from the front there because they also unfortunately experienced an outage and were very public in the way they reported on that outage and next steps and so on and so forth. So I think that is all about the end user and the impact on those end users.
And Christina, on that very note, I think you have a very recent lived experience where the end consumers were quite notably impacted by an MNO outage in Canada. And so a similar question to you, as you navigate these topics and these conversations, are the end users becoming part and parcel of the stakeholder fold, or is that still something that's more in the pipeline?
I think it's something that we can do a better job of in Canada. So we do, as Payments Canada, so the center of the ecosystem, we rely on our members quite a bit, and that's who we engage most often with. And at the operating level, in particular, when we talk about resiliency, we do have a stakeholder council that we do leverage. Their focus has not normally been on operational details of the payment system. So I think similar to Australia, I think it hits the news, and that's when it sort of becomes front of mind for the stakeholders.
And I think, we all can share a story or two where our consumers and end users have been the receiving end of being left a little bit out of the fold. But I would then, ask you, Mike, in the dynamics that is the USA, and you've got, the stakeholder folds quite diverse in their own right. What is the role of the consumer and business in these discussions?
I think the focus on the impact on the consumer is always front and center. I think it's actually ingrained into everyone's consciousness. When there's a disaster or an outage or an incident, I think besides restoration, everyone's first thought is, are people going to get their pay timely? So in the U.S., about 95% of workers get their salary or wage payments by electronic ACH payments. Direct deposit is what we call it, direct credit. You might know it in other parts of the world. And if those are timely, then that kind of incident or outage really doesn't rise into the public's consciousness. But as Christina alluded to, when people don't get paid on time, that's when I used to say it used to hit the press. Now it just hits social media, and you hear about it within hours if people are not getting paid on time. And it's the same with government grants and benefit payments. Those are distributed nearly 100% electronically in the U.S. And so as long as those payments get received on a timely basis, then the incident really doesn't become a public relations type of problem. So I think we're all pretty intensely focused on the impact of the end user.
Andy, yesterday, as we were talking about big bets, you made a comment in relation to ISO 20022, and that it does form part of the resilience response, as part of the big bets that have been made. And if you maybe can elaborate a bit on that, around in what context you made the statement around data sharing, and how that is important to resilience in your planning.
Yeah, so certainly when we started our ISO 20082 migration, we sought to understand how other countries had faced into it. And the example that really stood out was Hong Kong. I think Christina might want to comment in a second around Canada's thinking in this regard. But Hong Kong quite deliberately thought about its payment systems as being ISO 20082 enabled, so that effectively you had inbuilt resilience between payment systems. So if one of them went down, a corporate, a financial institution could still send the same message, and it would just be routed to a different payment system. Now, that isn't easy because you might have a high-value payment system that is relatively low volume, that has liquidity queuing in it, etc. And you might have a real-time payment system that is high volume, that doesn't have that liquidity management and has immediacy instead. And so they can't necessarily fill in for each other totally, but with some throttling of volumes, you can ensure that they do. And so I think that's certainly an aspirational goal for us as we think about the harmonisation that I mentioned yesterday. Effectively within the Australian environment, our high value system and our retail real-time payment system could effectively fill in for each other were one out. And I think I'm right in saying
that's exactly the same strategy that we're looking at, is we call it a payment hub, or a notion of a payments pattern, and being able to leverage one system for another in certain situations, not necessarily on a daily basis, but when the time is required to do that, then we'd be able to do that. And it's one of the benefits of modernizing your systems.
No? Oh, thank you for that. Steve, I'm going to put you a bit on the spot, and you touched on it a bit earlier, but more poignantly so, to say in your experiences and some of the examples you gave in the intro, when you look at the engagements that have been taking place and the lessons that have been learned, what would you say has been working well, but what are some of the things that you think could be done better and improved upon as this topic unfolds and becomes even more important in the sustainability and resilience of our payment systems?
Yeah, I think the discussions have been okay from an NZ point of view. If we think of the role of the consumer in that discussion, it's often by proxy, and that's either by proxy through the politician or through media or social media, as it is here. So I think the government has done not a bad job, but when they start to have the conversation, they talk as a regulator, not as either one of the suppliers of the service or the end user. And so they don't really think through some of the consequences of that, because their thinking is around as a regulatory point of view. So an example of that is going through a scenario. For example, there might be a cyber attack, the payment system is down. So from their point of view, they just naturally think, oh, that'll be about 4 days. But the reality is it's more likely to be about 10 or 12. Okay, so in that scenario, what does that mean? And not having those that actually understand how the core system works in the room, they're making really quite theoretical and academic type decisions on the way through. So I think from that point of view, they just need to get a bit more practical about what happens in reality and what happens on the ground in terms of trying to fix that as well.
Yeah. Very important consideration, pragmatically,
does.
practically, what does all this mean?
The good thing is they have
Yeah.
acknowledged that they were thinking of it just as a regulator, and so the next scenario planning that they'll go through, it'll be fairly dramatic, of course, as most of those scenarios are. There'll be something going on with a ransom attack, but they'll also assume things like, is it the government banker? And then that has another layer of issues around welfare payments, those sort of things. So, yeah, you can overplay some of those scenario plannings, but you think of the consequence, they're always a little bit undercooked.
Christina, areas of improvement. You also mentioned quite a strong involvement in terms of your governance, really standing by your side, as you said, as you navigate. But any other areas where you think hindsight being 2020 and looking forward can be improved upon as you navigate this very dynamic and evolving journey?
I think unfortunately we've had a few recent experiences with outages that have required us to make some changes. So I think unfortunately, fortunately, we're getting ahead in that space. One big area of improvement for us was really looking at our network resiliency and that notion of the last mile and the connection into the banks. And that was something that we had always had in our plans to look at doing, but we really expedited that work over the past year to make sure that we had a level of redundancy at that last mile that we hadn't really looked at before.
Thank you for that. At this point, with the 20 or 25 minutes that we have left, I'd like to move into a combination approach where we're going to explore some lived experiences and have our panel members share some of the context and some of the lessons learned, impact on payment system, and what that has meant in improving their plans and what they are looking to put in place to mitigate the risks going forward. But I'd also like to give the opportunity to the audience to share some questions with us through Slido. And so I will be trying to multitask two digital devices, so do wish me luck, and hopefully that will work out for us. I'd like to start with a Slido question, and it's from Anonymous, and that says, do you believe that cash is the business, so BCM, so business continuity management for electronic payments, therefore the need for cash to coexist as a payment mechanism? I will give this one to Mike, because I know you also do have a lived experience where this became quite
So my
an
short answer
important
to the question
consideration.
is no. In fact, I think in many of our major experiences, it's been the opposite. It's that the electronic systems have proved to be more resilient when it's been very difficult to clear check transactions or to distribute cash, or when there was no way to utilize cash. And still in the consciousness of us in the U.S. is Hurricane Katrina from August of 2005, in which New Orleans, an entire metropolitan area, was essentially shut down and underwater for a week or so. The central business district was flooded, neighborhoods were flooded, businesses with their back offices and their cash registers, or tills, I guess, if you will, were inaccessible. Bank branches were closed and flooded. Even the Federal Reserve, the central bank's branch in downtown New Orleans was flooded, and its vault flooded, and all of the checks that had been deposited to clear were destroyed. And even when the floodwaters receded, the checks were toxic. They had literally been under that sludge for a week, and kind of after the fact, one of our bank members kind of said, we should come up with a marketing slogan: "Checks will kill you." But having said that, really it was an impetus for providing more assistance electronically where possible. Like I said earlier, did people's pay arrive electronically? Did their benefits arrive electronically? The issue after that really became, could they access them, right? The longer that went on, the longer people were without power. Power undergirds everything, as does telecommunications. Those kinds of services have to be up and running. But the ability to move pieces of paper was impossible for over a week. So I wouldn't say in that sense that cash was a good continuity plan for anything because cash was kind of useless. One, you couldn't get it, and two, if you had it, there was nothing you could use it for.
And 3, it's poisonous.
And it was toxic. If it was underwater, it was toxic. Right.
Can I just add
Yes,
in on
please,
that point? So, I mean, I kind of broadly agree.
Yeah.
I think, though, the problem with continuity management is every incident's different, right?
Right.
And so cash is quite an interesting option. And so I think you'd probably want that option to persist. And as an example of something that we faced into in Australia, we had an outage, electricity outage in South Australia. And the only way around that really was literally to fly in ATMs with standalone generators. Because obviously with an electricity outage, you can't use POS terminals, you can't use digital payments. And so therefore cash provided a way of keeping the economy going over that period. I think also the other comment there would be there's quite obviously a section in society that does use cash as their own continuity management approach, right? That there are people who keep significant stocks of cash just in case electronic payments aren't working. We certainly see that in Australia where cash transactions are all-time lows, but actually banknotes in circulation, and I kind of do that around circulation because they're not circulating, they're not being transacted, are at all-time highs. And so that suggests that people are holding onto cash as a sort of fallback mechanism. And I think in that regard, I mean, we heard some of this in the previous session. It's interesting to think about how offline CBDC might actually replace that use case because people could have that store of value, they could use it in an offline way and therefore mirror that cash fallback mechanism.
And I think you mentioned there's actually a use case currently emerging in the China market, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. So China are trialling, in fact, beyond trialling, it's now almost mainstream in China now, offline CBDC. And that's been quite interesting because they've used that for a couple of different reasons. One has been around financial inclusion. So it's a way of getting people as part of the financial system that weren't previously. And the second one is to cope with areas where, network connectivity isn't great. And therefore, I just use an offline CBDC rather than an online payment mechanism.
That's definitely one to watch as the ever-emerging discussions around alternative solutions. So, and obviously CBDC in its own right being a topic of interest, so certainly keen to look out for that one. Thank you, Andy. I'm going to come back to you, Steve, when it comes to, again, some of the lessons learned and from an angle of an ecosystem effect and the consequence of not looking at things holistically within the ecosystems and the impact thereof. You did mention when you had Cyclone Gabriel and the impact of telcos in terms of the response or the impact they had on what then played out. Can you just give us a little bit more on that lived experience and again a little bit more on the lessons learned?
Yeah, so it's a fairly dramatic lived experience in the new year of this year when Cyclone Gabriel was tracking down and first of all took out the major metro, Auckland CBD, and then continued down the country. So Auckland was just sort of reeling in terms of the impact of that with flooding, houses falling down the side of hills and that sort of thing. So they had their own issues within a metropolitan area, but then it went further down into the east coast event to more rural or coastal areas, and that's where the really big impact had in terms of flooding, loss of housing, loss of lives, and so on. So it was quite profound. And so within that area too, the other dynamic that was playing out was it's a forestry area. So all of the waste, or what they call a slash from forestry, ended up banking up across bridges. Dam would create behind that. Bridge would be wiped out, and therefore all the connectivity, which often runs through bridges, is just gone. So they found themselves in a fair amount of strife. So telcos were down, electricity was down, and there was just no way to go through. So part of that response that occurred was that really trying to look at, and this sort of reinforces some of that regulatory thinking about what's important, what's not, is about the time it took for the telcos and the electricity to get up was just significant. So no one was actually responsible at the time for getting the payment system back up other than the Reserve Bank and cash. And so if we think about who was actually fixing the problem on the ground on the day around the electronic payments, it was actually the terminal providers who were working with the merchants, looking at those offline transactions and then saying, oi, Bob down the road has got a bit of power, run down there, download your system, then come back and keep transacting. So they did a really, really good job. So the big lesson there is you can think about how that's coordinated, but until you actually go through a real life scenario, often things get missed. And also the responsibility of electricity and the telcos become really, really significant in this, which is a no-brainer really.
No, thanks for that, Steve. And it links up to a question that we have from Anonymous on Slido. And how are you thinking of dealing with loss of connectivity? And so on that particular lived experience, I'd like to then pass on to Christina, who has a lived experience around one of your mobile network operators, loss of connectivity, and how that played out and some of the lessons that came out of that experience.
Yeah, it's quite a big experience. There's a lot to unpack in this. I'll try to focus it mostly on the payments impact. So in July of 2022, we had a national outage from one of our primary telecom providers, and it was the mobile network and the cable network that went out nationally. In the early hours of the morning, there was a lot of speculation on whether or not it was a cyber attack or what was actually causing this. There was no information being given out into the country. Approximately a third of our population uses this particular provider. I think the most impactful for me personally, when I look back, the most impactful piece of this was that the emergency services line 911 was inaccessible for a 24-hour period of time, and as a result there was one death in the country as a result of that. So that's a very unfortunate event that took place. From a payments perspective, our clearing and settlement systems were not impacted as we did not leverage this particular telecom provider for our processes. However, the national debit scheme went down for a 24-hour period of time. So there was no access to debit or to the ATM machines. So, and as a merchant, if you were a user of this network, then your POS systems were down as well. So it was very, very impactful for a large number of Canadians on that Friday in July, especially if you were waiting on payroll or if you were looking to make a rent payment. A lot of Canadians still do live paycheck to paycheck, so it was very impactful for them. As a result of this outage, 3 days later, this telecom was requested to come in front of Parliament to address some questions and concerns. And as a result of that, there is now a mutual agreement between our three major telecom providers where they have to mutually provide backup services to each other in an event that could occur like this again. And this is what actually spurred our look at that last mile piece of networking, because even though our systems were not impacted, there was one of our major, one of our largest members, who had that last mile on the same primary and secondary provider, who was this one particular telecom. So we did manage to fix that going forward, but was not identified until we went through an event such as that.
Yeah, and again highlighting the importance of the role of the consumer, or the impact on the consumer, and their livelihoods and the day-to-day requirements to the business when outages of that nature.
Yeah, and I think just one last point to make on that subject as well, that the national debit scheme was not designated as a prominent payment system either. So I do feel like that probably had an impact on this. Had they been designated, the oversight is far more strict on a designated system. So I'm not sure, had they been designated, would they been allowed to have their primary and secondary network provider as the same telco.
And touching on that, I'd like to then move into the next slide, a question which speaks to what extent do you test these crisis scenarios? And I guess to your point, your designation, your role and importance determines, I guess, the amount of attention and work that goes into, ensuring your resilience. And so I would like to maybe pass that on to Andy to say, in your scenario planning, to what extent are these scenarios fully and extensively tested for?
Yeah, so we test each of the clearing systems that we manage on an annual basis. So they're tested from a disaster recovery perspective. I think unfortunately over the last few years we've also had some real life tests, certainly for individual financial institutions and as I mentioned earlier, also the central bank. We also participate, there's a government group, a couple of different groups, one of which involves payments. We participate in that, and they helpfully run different scenarios each year. So again, it's an annual test, but the scenario is unknown until the day of the test exercise. And to my point earlier that every incident is different, we find that spectacularly helpful because it again thinks about not just the payment system, but the impact of the payment system on the wider digital economy and all of its end users. So that sort of combination of our own specific testing and that wider cross industry testing is pretty useful.
I'd like to take a little different approach to this, and that speaks to the us, human capital, and the role, considerations of human capital in this resilience planning and discussions. And start there by my end panelist, Mike. What are those conversations and what form are they taking around the human capability required to execute on these scenarios that are being planned for?
Yeah.
And are there concerns in regards to the skills?
Yes, of course there are concerns. I mean, humans have to be educated and trained and certified, so whether it's for risk management or product management, crisis management, disaster planning, that's all part of that conversation. Industry bodies such as yours, such as us in the US, the educational component is critical to have out front, and to be part of that exercise planning, to actually work through tabletop exercises. Those have become much more common for us in the US, especially in the wake of another event, another lived experience of the September 11th, 2001 attacks, to really designate critical infrastructures and to have coordinating bodies between government and industry to share information, but also to test, to conduct tabletop exercises and to react around the results. And so I think for, not just managers, but operators to have a role in that so they understand and are more adaptable. I think one of the things that's kind of interesting is that I think none of the testing or none of the plans predicted something like the events of September 11th, and I doubt very many of them prepared for a worldwide pandemic either, but institutions in the US at least seem to be fairly resilient around the COVID disruption, and were able to continue operations. So, and the humans were the critical piece of that to adapt.
And I'd like to just ask you this one, Steve. On the back of all this change that's taking place, technical skills are a given, but what other type of skills are emerging as required in order for us to navigate these kind of journeys that are emerging in the payments industry globally?
Well, I think from a resilience point of view, I think one of the key skills is common sense. And actually, no, seriously, in terms of when you think of some of the...
Is there a class for that?
What's that?
Is there a class available?
No. Yes, there is, but that's okay. Pastor runs a really good one. No, but it is not being flippant. That is actually practical solutions that can actually be executed is not that straightforward, because people they sort of treat this as a bit of an academic exercise rather than really treat it as something that is what's actually going to work. And that requires common sense. Probably not what you were expecting as an answer, but yeah.
Well, and there is that saying, common sense is not as common as we think.
No, it's not. Right?
So maybe there is an opportunity there to try and see if we can create a masterclass of some form, in the form of a master's degree or even venture. But yeah, I think the skill set discussions also become quite topical as to, do we need different types of skill sets to what we traditionally know?
Yeah.
But something to also
And
consider.
I think picking up on your human capital piece, often those that are actually doing the work, they're involved in it as well. So if you look at the Auckland scenario, the people that were trying to fix it, they were personally affected. Their house had been destroyed. They've had family members that are well. So that dealing with empathy and all those other things within those teams that are actually fixing it is a really interesting dynamic that comes into play as well. It's part of the recovery process.
There's a question here that says, our country, it's gone off. Let me see if I can navigate. I think to some extent this next question has been answered in part by Katrina, but to the other panelists, are countries making use of cloud, or are they implementing their own data centers to manage redundancy? I think Christina elaborated quite clearly on the Canadian front, but what are the scenarios playing out in New Zealand, Australia, the US?
I'm happy to chip in. So we're certainly seeing cloud emerge, particularly, for example, I think we might need to change the name of this, but HSMs, so hardware security modules, are becoming cloud HSMs, which probably means they're not hardware anymore. But anyway, so we're certainly seeing back-end processing, particularly of card transactions, go to cloud. PCI has done some pretty good work on that around standards for that, because it obviously does create some security concerns, and particularly where those clouds are offshore, there's a kind of sovereignty issue with that some regulators have. But I think it's a little bit like what you've seen in terms of the development of point of sale technology to be software based rather than hardware based. It's clearly a cost reduction exercise. But it's also a resilience play because you're no longer dependent on one bit of physical kit. You can have multiple instances of those cloud HSMs and have inbuilt resilience.
And I'm going to end off the Q&A with somewhat of a off-ramp question, as I'll call it, for Christina, around human capital. And you have a scenario that played out in Canada not so long ago, where you had one of your core teams, if I can call it that, have a 1 in 14 million event happen. Can you just give us a little bit of insight as to what that entailed and what were the implications on the operations of your payment system?
Yeah, it's quite an interesting story, not one I would necessarily call a disaster in terms of continuity, but it was definitely impactful. So we have a core team of operators for our high-value payment system in Canada, a team that had been together for decades. We're quite close-knit, and we're specialized in COBOL programming, which is not a skill that's as easy to come by these days. This team really enjoyed each other. They played the lottery together every week for years on end until they won together as a team. And so we had an entire team of 5 people win $60 million Canadian, so a very life-changing amount of money. And so you do a lot of planning around personnel, around key personnel, and how are you going to find redundancy for your one key person. We didn't do a lot of planning around what do you do if an entire team were to be as fortunate as this team was. Lucky for us, we have a very strong culture of employees who feel driven by our purpose, and they all showed up at work on Monday morning. And they came back and they committed to staying for a period of time. Some of them stayed for over a year as we worked through how to backfill their skill set and augment with some short-term staffing needs as well.
And legacy systems, COBOL skills, very rare.
Yes.
So key man risk there, very, very well handled. And I will note from a random number, 60 million Canadian dollars is equivalent to 840 South African rands. So 840 million South African rands. And so I will say to my boss, Geeta, in the event of 840 million rands, I might just need a week to take some time to take it in. And I also, like the Canadian team, will be back. And so, ladies and gentlemen, on that light note, I'd like to say thank you again for joining us this afternoon. What has become apparent is, as we continue to grow our digital payment rails in diverse use cases globally, interconnected, interlinked, interdependent, it has become essential to elevate the importance of resilience, preparedness, and having backup and alternative solutions that work, in the various cases of outages and disasters of different types and scale. and notably so, this is a very dynamic topic, as we've noted, that evolves, and as new information becomes available, we then need to be looking at ourselves differently and look at our payment systems differently accordingly. And so I'd like to thank you all again for joining us, our panel members for sharing their very interesting and very insightful lived experiences with us this afternoon. And I do invite all of you, if you have any further questions or comments, to please engage with our panel members. They are here with us for the rest of the day. And on that note, I wish you all an engaging and an informative day further, and enjoy the lunch. Cheers for now.